which happens to be my ward. You already know that he has decided not to run for re-election, but he maintains interest in the dynamics and happenings of our city, and has long been interested in the issue of transportation, mass transit here in Colombia, and that is what he's going to talk about with us today. Ian.
Thank you very much indeed, Wiley, and thanks everybody for inviting me to talk about my sort of perspective on public transit in Colombia at the present time. I do have some slides, and yes, it looks as if I have the ability to share my screen. So let me get, sorry.
And Ian, in case somebody else wants to be admitted, do go ahead and admit them.
Okay, and actually it's now saying Chris Kelly is asking to be admitted. So, but I see him here already, but anyway, perhaps we're gonna get, are we gonna get two Chris Kellys? All right, let me see now if I can share my screen. There we go. All right, can you see that opening slide?
Yes.
Great. Great. Okay, so I guess challenges and opportunities is the sort of theme of what I do after I present, you know, my initial observations and perspectives. I'm going to start by just reminding everybody, I'm sure this won't be new, but there are some tremendous individual and community benefits to having a robust public transit system, which many cities enjoy and Colombia really not so much. But just to remind us why it would be so valuable to really improve not just the service from our, you know, public transit provider, but the actual usage of it. We have to all buy into it and participate to make it work well. I'll give a brief history. I know there've been some, you know, big shifts in the way that the city's public transit operation, the route maps and the timetables and so on over the last, you know, 5 to 10 years. So I'll just quickly remind you of that because that's important as we look at where the transit system is right now. And then I will go through those challenges that are mostly very embedded and systemic challenges that we have to overcome if we're going to create a you know, a really robust transit system that serves the community well. And then some of the opportunities, maybe the areas we should focus as advocates in order to start rolling back and overcoming some of those challenges. So, oh, and I'm also going to, I've got a couple of pop quiz questions. So here's the first one. And I would like you to answer by typing in the chat, which hopefully I will have a way to see when I get to a slightly later slide in a few minutes. But yeah, if you want to take part in this, I'm afraid there's no prize. Type in the chat what you think the average annual cost of owning and operating an automobile in the United States is. And some of you may be familiar with this statistic, in which case that's great. And if you're not, just take a guess what you think that number would be. So whilst you're doing that, I'm going to talk about some of the individual and community benefits of a robust transit system. And these are not in a specific order, although I tried to make the different benefits flow in a you know, a way that makes sense. Road safety is one of the most important, and it's a well-documented, researched fact that when you are traveling by public transit, you have 10% of the likelihood of being killed or seriously injured in a traffic crash per mile traveled compared with when you're traveling in an automobile. So just on an individual basis, if you choose public transit, you reduce your risk of being involved in a fatal or serious injury crash by a factor of 10. Now, if you think about a city that has a very robust public transit system, More people are traveling by public transit than by automobile in that city compared to one without a strong public transit system. Not only that, if you look at cities with robust public transit systems, they are denser. And the average number of miles that people travel per day or per year is a lot less. You don't have people driving enormous distances to get to work, recreation, services, entertainment, and so on. So the total number of miles driven in a city with a robust transit system is a lot lower. So in addition to that factor of 10 reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes, you get another reduction in those crashes because the mileage people are traveling is lower. So there's an enormous road safety benefit to having a strong public transit system. I think the public health benefits are pretty obvious. And again, this has been documented by public health researchers. People living in cities that are well served by public transit get greater physical activity and are healthier, heart, lungs, and general health due to that increased physical activity, because they are walking or biking to a bus stop or to a train station and from that station at the end of the journey. And also from a public health point of view, the number of people traveling in mass transit per amount of pollutants put out by those vehicles, whether they're buses or trains, is a lot less than when people are one or two individuals to an automobile, putting out vastly more noxious fumes per person per mile than in mass transit. So you can improve the air quality of your city by having a robust public transit system. And obviously closely linked to that, you reduce your carbon footprint. And this is important as we see the impact of global climate change and the desperate need to really shift our transportation systems away from one or two person occupancy vehicles to more mass transit and shorter distances and much lower carbon emissions, eventually heading to zero carbon emissions. And Colombia has a goal around that. And I'll talk about this a little later. Unfortunately, the long-range transportation plan hasn't yet heard about the idea that we need to reduce our carbon emissions. So our climate plan and our transportation plan are completely at odds with each other, which I think is a very serious problem, something that has to be addressed. When you have a good public transportation system, you have access to transportation and equity for transportation. It's expensive to own and operate a car, and we'll have a look at your answers in the chat in a minute as to what you feel that number is. But with strong public transit, particularly serving low-income housing areas, you can greatly reduce that barrier of transportation. We just don't have that in Colombia. The hours of service and the frequency of routes is a long way from seriously enabling people on low incomes to live without a car. And so people on low incomes have to have a car and spend all of that money on buying and maintaining and operating that vehicle. And then when it breaks down, it's a great disruption to their lives. And that money comes away from paying for housing and food and childcare and healthcare, all the other important things that people on low incomes have to assess. There's also a tremendous saving to the government when we have a strong public transit system. The cost to build and maintain roads for the vast number of automobiles that will use them if you don't have a strong public transit system is much more than the cost to build and operate an efficient public mass transit system. So we can reduce our taxes if we would invest in a strong public transit system. There's a congestion management benefit. Clearly, if you have 20 or 30 people on a bus that's 40 feet long, that's the same amount of road space that you generally fit one or two cars with one or two or four people in it. So if we want to address congestion, then let's invest in public transit. Increasingly these days, and this has been a key in other cities, not in Colombia yet, but hopefully, as you invest in public transit, particularly light rail and bus rapid transit, where there's more of a station structure built, it greatly increases the economic activity in that area. Investment comes in, creates jobs. If you have the correct zoning, you can create jobs as well as affordable housing close to rapid bus transit stops and light rail stations, and really improve the economy. There's a lot of care has to be taken to avoid gentrification and displacement of people as these transportation systems go in, but there are some best practices on how to do that. Clearly, when people are using mass transit, it is a much more efficient way to travel around. The efficiencies involve in the amount of land it takes to have a transportation system, as well as the time it takes and the amount you spend on infrastructure and vehicles and everything else. So efficiency is huge, and there is a quality of life benefit increasingly so. And we see younger people, the millennial generation and younger generations, much more interested in not owning a car and living in a place where they can walk and take transit to work, to other destinations, because of that quality of life benefit. So let me see. Can somebody see? I can't see the chat at the moment because I've got my slides up. Can somebody read some of the numbers that people have put in as the average annual cost of owning and operating a vehicle?
Ian, it looks like we've got a half dozen or so entries. From the low end, I think, is 2,500, and the high guess is 7,500. And most of them they're all the others are in between there. So
yeah, those are not bad. Those are not bad. They're not completely out of the ballpark. The number is higher than all of those. It's close to $10,000 per year, and that's the cost of purchasing the car annualized over however many years that is that you own that car, which may be in the form of payments or an upfront, cash payment, as well as all of those operating costs, maintenance and repairs, gas, tax and insurance, parking fees, and so on. It's averaged for the average mileage per year, which is about 15,000 miles per year. So if you drive fewer than that, then that number is going to be lower. If you drive more than that, it's going to be higher. But nevertheless, that's $9,500 a year for the average car-owning family. And of course, if your family has two cars, which many, many families do, that's $19,000 a year. That's a lot of money that you could spend, or families could spend, on other priorities. And I'm going to just take this analogy a little bit further. We have about 50,000 households in Colombia. This is a guess, and it may be a little high, but I have assumed that on average, the households have two cars per household. Even my household has one car, and I work really hard to keep that number as low as possible. So I think that two cars per household is not unreasonable. So that's a total of 100,000 cars in Colombia, and we multiply that 950,000. Wait a minute, let me just go back again. Have I got this right? $9,500 by 100,000 cars in Colombia, and we come up to nearly $1 billion a year that the residents of Colombia are spending on owning and operating our cars. Of course, that totally dwarfs how much the city spends on our public transit system. By a factor of many hundreds. It even dwarfs, it's more than double the entire city budget. But that is our car budget in one city of 50,000 households with two cars per household. So that's a lot of money. And so when we say, oh, we can't afford to run a transit system, it's more about not having the will to do it. It's not really that the money isn't there. If we could, some of us reduce from being a two-car household to a one-car household, frees up an enormous amount of money. Okay, well, let's talk about what's happened to transit in Colombia over recent years. When I first kind of moved here in the late 90s and all the way through till 2014, we ran what was called the Orbital loop system. And this was a very typical system that cities adopted, in the middle of the last century or even earlier. And it had gradually grown with Colombia. The center point was the Wabash station right downtown, just a couple of blocks north of Broadway. And in those days, I think there were 8 buses would start there. They'd head out in different directions. They'd do loops and come back to that central bus station and then just kind of, stir and repeat all day long. And it worked reasonably well. It covered much of the city. But gradually, as the city had grown more and more, and this is a really important factor as we talk about efficient transit, we have annexed enormous quantities of land. The city, the residential area has got larger and larger over the last many decades. It was getting to take longer and longer for those loops to serve those distant corners and get back in a reasonable time to do the next route. So in about 2014, the city staff came up with a new concept, which I've called the Decentralized System. And this essentially took Wabash out of the equation, which I thought was a tremendous shame because it's a beautiful building, it's a historic building. It was a train station before it became a bus station. And it's, for a period, it was not being used. And I'm gonna just show you a map of that system. I'm sorry, this isn't the easiest map to see. But if you kind of look in the middle, you can see a smallish, it kind of went a little bit onto the university campus and around downtown, and it just ran around that very central area. There were 2 major connectors, I think they were called, the gold and the black. And the gold went out west on Broadway and came back on Worley, and then it went all the way out east to almost Highway 63 and looped around and back to downtown. It didn't stop at Wabash Station, I don't think. Wabash was essentially taken out of it. And then a sort of a similar route was the black route, which did the same kind of thing north and south, going up Providence and back down Range Line, and then south on Providence and down to those apartments there. That was sort of the backbone of it. And then there were about 5 or 6 more neighborhood loops, they were called. And I looked fondly at the green one because that was the one that I was able to get. The green, and there was the purple as well. In my location in the 4th Ward. They don't exist anymore, so I have to walk nearly 2 miles to the nearest bus stop from my house now. But for a while they were closer, and we had those 1 bus on each of those loops going round. Now, the problem was that there was so little demand for transit in some of those areas, it really didn't make sense to run those buses. And I know that green loop, I'd talk to the driver sometimes, and it would be, 5 o'clock in the evening, and I'm heading downtown for a council meeting, and he told me that I was like the 5th passenger he'd had on the bus all day. So that didn't work very well. And then in 2000, and the utility was losing money and running too many buses, and not that fares make up a very large proportion. But that inefficient system was far too expensive to operate. The number of buses and the number of drivers working per day had to be reduced. So the staff then went to the hub and spoke system, which actually had been proposed by a consultant about 2015, 16. And they went back to that consultant's recommendation and pretty much implemented it. And this is a good place where we are right now, even though it doesn't serve me very well and a number of other people in outlying areas. What it does is it puts the bus routes along the corridors where there is the highest transit propensity. The consultant did a lot of analysis of who lives where are the densest areas of town, where are the most low-income neighborhoods, where are the most students, who are the people who are most likely to use transit, and put the bus routes there. So we now have six routes. It's not significantly different than the orbital loop system we had before, except that they tend to just go out and back along the same route. And they don't go as far. They just cannot cover the whole city, and there's only 6 of them. But we see them there going out along Broadway, Worley, up north on Range Line, Paris Road, and then out towards Battle High School, Broadway East and around the big shopping mall out there, and then south down Providence to quite a bit of apartment housing down there. So that's where we are. Let's talk about challenges, and I've got another pop quiz. So here's the second pop quiz. What is Colombia's average population density? And I'd like that number in number of residents per acre of the city of Colombia. So while you're thinking about that and putting your guesses in, I want to talk about challenges. So challenges for public transit are many. A lot of them revolve around culture and history and experience. So I'll start with management. For most of the time that the city of Colombia has run transit, it has been managed by people and entire departments who have no experience of transit, who have not lived in a city with good transit and do not understand what passengers need and how to operate a system well. It was the manager for a long time was a retired military, which interestingly is common across the country. It seemed to be a very routine career transition from the military to running transit systems all over the country. But it was very top down, and it was done for the sort of convenience and efficiency of the operators with very little consideration of what the public really needs. I think that's really changed recently, and we did have, unfortunately, she didn't stay very long, but we did have a wonderful transit manager for a couple of years who really had some very progressive ideas and was moving us, I think, very much in the right direction. I kind of think her ideas were a little too progressive for the culture of the Public Works Department and so on, and she left without implementing many of them, unfortunately. We also have a community culture of driving, and there are very few people in the city who don't have a car, who don't use a car for most of their journeys. So we're starting from a point of needing to kind of change the way people have always operated, and that's just really, really hard. I specifically call out the University of Missouri because the University of Missouri could be a tremendous ally in moving us to having a much better transit system. So far, despite a lot of efforts by myself and others, they have not shown any interest in doing that. Even though, and I'm going to come back to this when we talk about opportunities, there are examples all over the country, all over the Southeastern Conference, all over college towns in America, where this works really well. But the University of Missouri has resisted the change, which would involve really making transit travel for students more the norm. And that could really, catalyze a big change in the city as a whole and real transformation. The CATSO Long Range Transportation Plan. CATSO is the Columbia Area Transportation Study Organization. It is a federally mandated committee of supposedly elected officials and bureaucrats in planning and transportation from the city of Columbia, Boone County, and MoDOT, who make very consequential decisions and votes on tens of millions of dollars of federal transportation planning and implementation funds every year. It's almost entirely unaccountable, which is a tremendous shame. It's rooted in 1950s, 60s transportation planning, philosophy, which is about just expand highways, expand highways, expand highways. And if, people are asking for public transit, throw a little bit of money at that and walking and biking. it's really important that this body is changed. The mayor of Colombia and the presiding commissioner of Boone County both have votes on this committee. Unfortunately, neither of them ever attends a meeting or casts their vote, with the result that the entire decision-making process of CATSO Coordinating Committee is made by unelected bureaucrats, almost all of whom are old white men who have been working in this field for decades and decades and are completely out of touch with the public. So that's a shame, and it's something that we really need to change. The City of Columbia itself, which is separate from CATSO, City of Columbia is just one member of that multi-government committee, makes poor policy choices on a regular basis, which work against good transit. We don't allocate enough funding to transit. We allocate far too much to roads and road widening. And of course, that flows from the decisions made by the CATSO committee. I think the number is 81% of all of our residential land is zoned single family, which means you can only build single family homes on that land. Not just that single family homes are allowed, but that's the only thing. Vast acreages of the city are zoned single family, which requires something like 1/3 of an acre per lot. And so people are spread out far apart, and the only way to connect is then to build big highways, which all works against public transit. We then require every business and developers of residential housing to provide enormous acreages of parking in order to, and it's usually the worst possible case, every business has enough parking for the day after Thanksgiving Day when everybody goes shopping. At least that's the case for the mall. So that also pushes things out further, creates the distances that make transit very, very unfeasible. And then we continually put money, millions of dollars every year, into expanding our highways, expanding our roads into highways, and then our highways into multi-lane highways. And this is a progression that's gone on since, really since the 1950s with the, start of the Interstate Highway Program, and then the decision to build all transportation infrastructure, even inside cities, in the same style as interstates. We do not plan for land use and transportation in a coordinated way. There's a lot of siloing, which if that land use and transportation planning process was better integrated, as it is in some cities, then you can see where you don't need to build big wide highways and where you can add density and create, more livable communities that don't require everybody to have a car. And then finally, our population density is so low that it makes it very difficult to run a transit system. So on that topic, let's see, David, could you read me some of the answers for what people think the number of people per acre?
Again, we've got not as many answers as last time. I think the lowest is 1.5 per acre, and the highest I saw 30 per acre. Mm-hmm. We got, I think, only 5 or so. There's 6, maybe 6 entries, but
that's great.
1.5. We throw away the 2 high ones. I'd say most of the others look like about 15, 10 to 15. So.
Yeah. Well, whoever wrote 1.5 is pretty close. It's actually a little larger than that. It works out at about 3 people per acre for our 125,000 population spread over 62 square miles, which is about 40,000 acres. And if you just visualize an acre of land with 3 people standing on it over the whole city of Columbia, you can sort of see why it's going to be hard to run a public transit system that's going to have the ridership to make it even worthwhile. The distances are long and the number of riders are going to be small. Now, this is the town where I grew up, Burnley in Lancashire in northern England, population 73,000, and I'm going to ask the same question, but I'm going to give you the answer right away. I went to look it up because I remember, it's got a pretty robust public transit system, by no means perfect, but there are buses that run all day and all night, less so at night. During the day, when you go to the nearest bus stop, which will usually be within a block or two, you'll wait a maximum of about 10 or 15 minutes till the next bus comes. A lot of people don't even carry a bus timetable because they know it's going to be along, very soon, as long as it's during the main part of the working day. Covers the whole city, which is not very big. See, there are 6.1 square miles as opposed to 61 square miles here in Colombia, slightly smaller population. The result of that is we have 20 people per acre. And of course, the city also has 3 railway stations in different parts of the city, which then serve other towns, within 20, 30, 50 miles away. And those have very good service as well, so that you can hop on a train and go to the town, 30 miles away for the day and come back again. And it's really, it's no slower than driving, and in fact it's often quicker. And of course the train stations are in the center of town, which is where the bus station is, so you can then get out to whichever part of town you want to be. So that works really well. So I think that number, is somewhere between 3 people per acre and 20 people per acre. We get to a critical point at which transit becomes feasible. So, having talked about the challenges, let's talk about the opportunities. And then I hope am I staying on schedule, David or Wiley?
No, we've got until 1:15, so you still got another half an hour. So
okay.
Anytime.
Well, I won't use that. I'll probably use another 10 minutes or so, and then we can have a discussion. So I'm going to talk about a number of opportunities that I think we should try to bring to reality over the coming years in order to sort of break the logjam on transit and start shifting to a more, a better transit service that those of us that don't always, that maybe currently travel by car would start using, so that we're actually, not just providing the service, but using it. So the first I referred to earlier, that's the UPass system. If we could get the UPass system at the University of Missouri, that would be a catalyst. And I'll talk a bit more about that after just going through this list. We need to, as I mentioned before, update the CATSO long-range transportation plan and align it with the climate action and adaptation plan. At the moment, they are opposites. But that would be an opportunity to do that. That would be a long-term opportunity, because those long-range transportation planning decisions flow into the city budget and kind of, over years have their impact. The current system design and the fact that we have fare-free operations is another huge opportunity and something we can definitely build on. And then I'll just talk about transit-oriented development a little bit at the end. So the UPass system is something that I think the first ones were in the 80s or 90s. I do know the story at the University of Illinois, which was the early 90s, where the university was getting ready to build 2 more parking structures for students and staff. And the students rose up against this. It was an environmental movement among the students, and they said, we don't want more parking structures. We don't want more driving. We want really good transit. And they negotiated with the regional transit provider, which is called the Champaign-Urbana Mass Transit District, and negotiated an arrangement by which the student body as a whole would make a lump sum payment to the transit district, and in return, all students would travel free. And the students had to have a referendum to approve this, because this was essentially a student fee that they were going to charge. And they had this referendum, and it passed narrowly. So they did provide that funding, and the students traveled free for a year. And it was so successful that when they held the referendum about continuing it at the end of that first year, it passed overwhelmingly. And they now pay, I think it's about $100. Each student pays about $100 a year. It's built into the tuition fee now. That money is aggregated and goes to the Champaign-Urbana Mass Transit District, and every student card is a free bus pass. And with that additional money, the Mass Transit District has put on a lot of additional bus routes, and they've designed them to serve the students, since the students are essentially paying for this expansion, which started in the 90s and has continued. And the university holds that referendum every 3 years, and it always passes with a significant majority of the vote. So those other bullets there, I think, have I think I've summarized that in telling the story of Champaign-Urbana. And now that model exists, at least the last time I checked, 137 universities and colleges in the United States. In fact, I have not managed to find a university or college in the United States in a city that has a mass transit system that does not have this program, except Columbia, Missouri, where the University of Missouri has not bought into it, has resisted calls for it by students and community advocates and city officials over a long period of time. And that's where we are. The opportunity is if we can convince the university to change their position on this. And this has gone through multiple different administrations of the chancellor. The typical student fee is somewhere between 50 and 150, and that money can be recovered by the university either by a line item on tuition bill, or some universities actually overcharge for parking and then take that amount from the parking utility as a sort of a surplus and use it to pay the student fee. So it creates this economic incentive for students to use transit. It's free. They arrive, they know it's free before they even make their plans to move to the town. They know they're going to have free transit. They get the bus map, and this many, not every, of course, but many students make that plan to be a transit rider while they're at university. Let's see. So I'm not going to read all this, but I'll just encourage you to kind of cast your eyes over this list of benefits for the university, benefits for the students, and benefits for the community at large. And just like the benefits of transit in general, the UPass system, it seems to me, provides such an overwhelming array of benefits. It's really hard to understand why the University of Missouri won't do it. The students, I mean, I will say it's not just the administrators. I've talked to groups of students that are opposed to it. I would say that if they did that referendum, it would be very closely balanced. There are plenty of students who support it when it's explained to them, but a lot of them don't even know about it. And I've worked with groups of, of students trying to make change within their institution, but of course they're only there for 4 years and then they've moved on. So it's really hard to build a movement there within that student body. But students that meet, somebody from the University of Kansas that has it, or Iowa State or Florida, are incredibly, speak incredibly favorably about it and convince a lot of our students. But nevertheless, it's just that so hard to change that status quo. And the university, meanwhile, manages, I think it's something like 25,000 parking spaces on that small campus, and has all of those cars coming in every day and going out again. In fact, they use transit in a really bizarre way, and the the City of Columbia has the contract for this. They have 10,000 or more students drive their cars to various remote parking lots, and then they run buses to pick them up from that parking lot and take them to the campus, because there's not enough space for all those cars on campus. So these students, they get up in some part of Columbia where they live, they get in their car, they drive to somewhere like Reactor Field down by Providence Road. They get out of the car, they go to a bus stop. The bus comes pretty frequently, but it only takes them one place, to campus. And then at the end of the day, they take that bus again, a couple of miles, and they get back in their car. I mean, what an inefficient, crazy system. And the university pays the city $1.25 million a year to provide that service. I advocate these days that we stop doing that. We don't provide that service to the university because it actually undermines our goals to improve transit. But because you can only use that system if you own a car and you're a student and you have this remote parking place. So if we can get the university to change its mind about this, then I think that would be a tremendous opportunity. And I think here just a few more that really this just repeats what we've done before. One important point would be we would want to start that annual student fee for transportation at a low level, because our level of service is not very good at the moment. And so we would want to, keep it low, and we would want to work very closely with the students as to how we should use that additional money for our public transit system to serve them as well as possible. But even if we did it $50 a year, that would, with 30,000 students, that would raise $1.5 million, and that would increase our annual transit budget by 25% right there. So we could significantly add routes. All right, now we'll talk about the conflict between the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan and the CATSO Long Range Transportation Plan. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we have some ambitious goals for our climate emissions over the next 30 years or so. And this is specifically the goals around transportation. At present, 85% of our trips are taken by single occupancy vehicle, and it's more like 93% by private vehicle, adding in the carpooling to the single occupancy vehicle. But we'll just focus on the single occupancy vehicle. In order to stay on track with our climate action plan, which is extremely important, we need to cut that more than in half. We need to get that down to 40% in now the next 14, 13 years, 2035, and then down to 10% by 2050. And that is assuming some transition to electrification of vehicles and solar energy powering those vehicles, but we have to reduce the number of vehicles. There's a tremendous carbon footprint to manufacturing and disposing of vehicles, in addition to the fossil fuels that are burned. So we need to reduce single occupancy and private vehicle use, and we need to increase mass transit. So right now, mass transit is about I think it's less than 1% of trips in Colombia as a whole. According to the Climate Task Force, which then transformed into the Climate and Environment Commission, we need to increase that to 15% by 2035. And I haven't seen any interest from our planning and transportation department or our partners in other governments in how we're going to do that. But it's important we start thinking about it. And then on to 40% by 2050, if we're going to hit our climate goals. So what is the CATSO Long Range Transportation Plan doing? Well, it is projecting spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars on road expansions. And not just road expansions in town, road expansions that go out into undeveloped areas, because that's what they've always done since the 1950s, when the federal funding and the Metropolitan Planning Organization process was first set up. I think that this list shows $250 million over the next 30 years, just on 8 projects, 8 relatively small projects. I think each of these is a mile or two. A huge amount of money and just the wrong vision and the wrong direction. And I hope we can stop many or most of these projects from happening and put this future money into sustainable and healthy and equitable transportation. All right, so that would be another opportunity if we can change the CATSO Long Range Transportation Plan. So our current system does give me some hope. This is the previous system, the decentralized system that we had from 2014 to 2019. It was very well intentioned. It was trying to cover every part of Colombia, have everybody within a mile or so of a bus route. And it sort of just about did that. The problem was, though, that it was very expensive to operate because it was a large number of buses and it didn't have very high ridership. This is called, in the sort of transit planning business, the coverage model, where you try to cover your whole area with some level of service. The alternative is the productivity model, where you try to maximize the ridership per mile of transit served. And that is what we have now. That is the recommendation that Olson Associates, the consultant, gave us to really, I mean, it's unfortunate. We have to just provide no service to a lot of areas. And there were a few people using those buses, and they are without service now. But if we want to grow the system, if we want to have a sort of a firm foundation to build our system, we have to start where the most transit riders are. And that was what that analysis did, that identified these routes, the productivity model. Now, there's been a huge disruption to transit, as there is to everything else as a result of COVID. But nevertheless, the ridership numbers, since this was introduced shortly before COVID, are quite impressive, significantly higher. There was obviously a temporary blip, but now you're required to wear masks all the time on the buses. The drivers wear masks and enforce that rule. I think we're sort of, back to where we would be even if COVID hadn't happened. People are using the buses because they are going where they want to go for the most part, and they're frequent. These buses go back and forth they go all the way out and back in 45 minutes. So there's a bus going this way. If you're somewhere along Broadway, there's a bus going that way, and 20 minutes later, there's a bus going the other way. It's the same bus. And then another 20 minutes later, it's going back out again. So it's still not great service. You want to get those headways down to about 15 minutes to have people really, really kind of use transit in large numbers. But it's a lot better than it was. And those buses are quite full many, many times of the day. The other good thing that's happened, although there is a caveat, is we've gone fare free. And I have pushed for this for many, many years. There are a couple of great models where going fare free really propelled ridership, use of transit. One is Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Another one is Missoula, Montana. Both college towns, somewhat similar size to Columbia. Both are denser than Columbia, which is an advantage for them. But nevertheless, we did go fare free at the beginning of the pandemic. I think the main motivation for that was so that the drivers aren't handling money. But we've kept it fare free. The city manager, we've received a lot of federal money through the CARES Act and other COVID relief federal funds, which has been very much appreciated and very helpful to keep transit systems running all across the country. And that has allowed us to keep that fare free. And it is not really causing any kind of significant hit to the operating budget, because those fares only accounted for about 10% of the entire budget. Most of the funding for our system comes from the transportation sales tax and from federal funds, which approximately match the amount of transportation sales tax we put into transit locally. And so that 10% was provided at a cost of depressing ridership, because people have to find that $1.75 for every trip, time wasted with paying when people get on. So if you think about, government services in a level of service model, we can provide a better level of service, faster trips if people are getting on and off the bus without having to pay for it, as well as the sort of the COVID, the health risk benefits, which was the main reason. But I'm hopeful we will keep fare free. The one caveat I mentioned is that we had some leverage over the university when we charged everybody $1.75 to ride, because we could tell them that the students would ride free if they just came up with this, universal transit fee for all students. Well, everybody's riding free now anyway, so we don't have that incentive for them. However, I hope that the university will see the benefit nevertheless of contributing funds so that we can design the routes that the students need, and that we can be part of a sort of a community-wide effort to create, efficient transportation in the city. But this is the right place to start. We have high ridership, and as we identify more funding sources, then we should look to expand these routes, again with an eye to where the highest transit propensity is. And then final slide, transit-oriented development is it's essentially an approach to zoning, which creates special rules around transit stations. And these can be, you know, bus interchanges, bus rapid transit stations, and train stations, where denser, taller buildings are allowed, where parking requirements are greatly reduced or waived, where the whole goal is to attract a lower income, non-car owning, transit using population to live, and restaurants and retail services and office services to locate in that convenient location. And developers love transit-oriented development zoning codes. They do drive up the cost. The one, you know, risk we have with adopting this, and I could imagine, you know, a transit-oriented development code along some of our major, where those bus routes are running right now, Broadway going west and east, Providence Road going south and north, create transit hubs along there with different zoning so that as those areas redevelop, we can develop denser, taller, much less car-oriented, and make that, you know, transit stop the kind of the key point for people coming and going into that area and driving development and commerce in that local transit-oriented development zone. So with that, I'd love to get some responses and some questions.
Ian, there are quite a few questions in the chat, and if you'll make me host, then that would be good.
I will be happy to do that. How do I do that?
My name is Pam, right next to
Pam,
you.
there you go, Pam. If I click more,
and go to the right.
Got it. Make you host and make Pam the meeting host. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Can you see now those questions?
Oh, let me see.
Have any council candidates expressed interest in improving Colombia's transit system?
Well, I'll let Carl answer for himself, and Nick. Any other council candidates on the call right now? So certainly Barbara Buffalo, who of course was the sustainability director, has always been a strong supporter of expanded transit. So I am excited to see what her platform looks like regarding transportation. Chris Kelly's on the call. He was a council candidate of the past, and Al Taka. So I haven't had a lot of conversations with candidates, to be honest. So I'd love to just, you know, toss it out to those of you that are to respond. Nick, you want to go first?
Well, I guess I will, since you pointed me out. Thanks so much, Ian. Well, I appreciated hearing your presentation. And of course, this is an area of concern for me, and it has been for some time, largely because of my experience at BAC. And transportation for low-income people is an ongoing issue. And so that's one of the areas of concern I have about it. There's also the climate issue that I think is huge, and your information about the transportation plan and the climate action plan and how those don't align, that I think bears some further study and review. But in general, I'm for a more robust public transit system. I am also glad that the bus rides are free now. I do think that increases the ridership and so forth. So that's where I am, basically, I'd say.
Carl?
Yeah, well, there's so much to tackle here because I get a bit of history with this, but let's start out with, I think the productivity system certainly is much better than the other systems that preceded it. The idea of free fares, I think first introduced on the council, as I recall, was with Barbara Hoppe. didn't receive a warm reception at that time. And we had some setbacks when we had the former mayor, Bob McDavid, who did not negotiate very well with the university. So that addresses some of the university system. But I do think we missed an opportunity, I think it was 2014, in increasing the development fee for particularly as it relates to roads and roads associated with new development. When that was defeated in a public referendum, when we should have, instead of increasing that fee from 5 cents to 50 cents per square foot, probably should have been $1 or $2, and it went down in flames. So that those monies could have gone towards transit. And then one other issue, one that you brought up, Ian, some time ago, and did not receive the warm endorsement of the entire city council, but I think the time has come probably, and that has to do with parking at the airports. And I think although the intention now is, as I understand it, is to use any additional parking fees that may be imposed on some of these new lots for issues related just to the airport, I think it's also timely to start having that discussion about using some of those fees for transportation to and from the airport. And I'm hoping that it's a very thorny question, as you know, Ian, about the critical mass and the size of our city and transit-oriented development and density and gentrification and all those other kinds of things. We have to be very sensitive to that. But as we grow, I think some of these ideas are fertile, and some of these ideas ought to be further funded. It's part of my, I mean, I haven't elucidated my campaign entirely to a lot of the public, but it's on my list, and I put it in the chat, that it's among my list of citywide priorities and citywide, more broadly addressed issues. Public transit is important, and it's also important to bring a win into this in terms of climate change and those goals that we have set as goals. But and I hope we can reach some of those goals, but I'm not entirely sure that we can get there. But this is certainly vital to that effort.
Right, thanks, Carl. Herb, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you for bringing this forward at this time. I am very appreciative, known for decades that we needed to get our act together in this area. I wonder if your perspective is quite broad enough, however. I had many conversations with Mark Landrum, the late Mark Landrum, about this, who was not an explicit advocate for greatly increased public funding for this, but he did have a key point, and I credit him for it. If you want to do as other more culturally and socially advanced communities have accomplished, you need to get all the different fiefdoms lined up. You have identified the University of Missouri as a crucial one. So is the Columbia Public Schools. Absolutely. Plus the scores of private providers of disability services and bus services and so forth. This parallels other enterprises, but without it, he argued, and I think he was right on the data, it's not going to work unless you get all or nearly all of the fiefdoms working together.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Herb, and that's maybe a challenge that I missed off my list, the coordination of all of these entities. And you're right, there are a lot of private social service funded transit providers, often for people with disabilities. And when you look at the network of the transit services that are available, it's very inefficient. You end up with a lot of vans and buses and vehicles, you know, driving around, not actually serving somebody. If that could be better coordinated into one system, then it would be more efficient. And just within GoComo, as Columbia Transit is now called, there's a great example of that. In addition to all of the fixed route buses I mentioned, we do essentially a taxi door-to-door type service for people with disabilities called Paratransit. And that is by far the most expensive service. I think it's like 30 times more expensive per passenger mile to provide paratransit. We have to, and it's right that we have to. It's a civil rights law in order to receive federal money for our transit system. And I'm glad we provide it. But if we could, for instance, improve the sidewalk conditions around our regular bus stops and connecting into neighborhoods, then a lot of people who are currently using paratransit and costing the city 30 times more. All of our regular buses are very accessible. They have these automatic wheelchair ramps that kind of fold out, and there are specific places on the bus where somebody in a wheelchair can park and be kind of connected to the bus, so that if there's a sudden lurch or something, they're not going to be, thrown around. I think a lot of people who currently use paratransit would use the regular service because there's more independence that way. Yeah. But a large part of the reason is that there are not enough routes, not enough service, and the sidewalk conditions to get to those bus stops is not there. And I'll also quickly respond on the public schools, because I see that Chris Kelly also, or actually, I'm sorry, Scott Orr mentioned that in the chat. Yes, there was one of the things that the partnership with public schools ran into was, I believe, a state law passed by the school bus, the yellow school bus lobbying machine, that made it illegal for the city to provide service to the schools. But I don't think the benefits would be there anything like so much with the public schools. I mean, the public schools runs a reasonably efficient system as it is. Those yellow buses, they fill up with kids. They just travel the hours the kids are traveling. And it is, if more parents would put their children on the yellow buses, then we would greatly reduce vehicle miles traveled in Colombia. And also, many of those schools are outside city limits. They are, many of the children live way outside. So it was never totally clear to me that there would be an enormous benefit to Columbia Transit picking up the work. I think we would end up doing what the yellow buses do in many cases, is run special routes just for the school kids, and that the overlap with our existing routes there would be some, but it wouldn't be anything like as impressive as if we could do it for the university students. Go ahead.
This is Chris.
Yeah.
I don't know how you deal with the democracy problem. By that, I mean this. A generation ago, I was flying to Europe, and I sat next to a man who was a transportation engineer for the city of Vienna. He was here for some big transportation marshmallow toast. Anyway, I was effusive about the trains in Austria and the trains all over Europe and blah, blah, blah. We all know that and like that. He said, yes, that is true. We have fast trains that are clean, reasonable, and go everywhere. We have terrible roads. You have bad trains that are dirty, late, and go nowhere, and good roads. And in Europe, everyone is leaving the trains for their automobiles to drive on our little nasty 700-year-old roads because people want to be in their cars. Now, that's a huge democracy problem for the kind of mass transit that you're talking about. And I think that it adds up to, we ought to be doing better mass transit, but you can't do it to the exclusion of highways and automobiles. You have to do it in addition to. Because, for instance, I saw your CATSO recommendations. I think 2 of those are in the 4th Ward. If in the next 4th Ward council race, one candidate is against both of those and the other candidate is for them, the candidate who is for them is going to win the election. Because people want that highway. And I don't even. I mean, I am a huge train guy. I go there on trains just for fun. But I don't know how you get around the democracy problem.
Well, it's an interesting point. I don't totally accept your premise. You know, I travel back to England on a reasonably regular basis, and I haven't seen or detected a shift in the recent years or decades away from people wanting to use public transit to cars. Certainly, there are some people who prefer prefer cars to public transit. But there are a lot of people who are very satisfied with public transit and it serves their needs. And I don't know if they really have analyzed the benefits or the comparison, but I'm not sure that there's a great, overwhelming demand to shut down, to stop putting money into transit and instead, and of course, people pay fares for transit. They just pay a heck of a lot less than $9,500 a year, which is what it costs to own a car. And as far as, the voting, democracy, and Fourth Ward, indeed, at least one of those projects is in the Fourth Ward. It's the widening of Forum Boulevard from Chapel Hill Road to Woodrail. It's a little over a mile. Actually, it's a little under a mile. It's in the CATSO long-range transportation plan for something like $15 million to widen what is currently a very well-functioning two-lane road to 4 lanes, simply because it's been in the CATSO long-range transportation plan since like the 1950s. And it's too much of a stretch to do a proper analysis as to whether that project is really needed or not. I live very close to there. It's in the Fourth Ward. It goes into the Fifth Ward. And I walk down there and I have the only time I've ever seen a problem with traffic congestion was when Chapel Hill Road was closed for a project and a lot of traffic that normally used Scott Boulevard and Chapel Hill Road kind of came that way. And even then, it was like slowing people down by about 3 or 4 minutes getting through that area. And I have campaigned loudly and vocally that we should not do that project and received almost no political pushback from that. And I've
had you not done so, Mary Angela would have haunted you until you died, because she was such a champion of and I would be where you are on that. But the fact is, you do have a big, big democracy problem with anything that interferes with automobiles.
Well, I feel like that if we can provide good information, data, education about the benefits of a different way of thinking about public transit and transportation in general, then we can move that democracy problem to people voting for what makes sense. I mean, I guess it's the tragedy of the commons, but people do vote for good things in the commons. I mean, look at public education. Thank goodness we don't all send our children to private tutors, and if you can't afford it, you don't get educated. I think it's a similar thing. We need to do it for transportation. We need to do it for health. But the benefits are clear to me when you look at the numbers.
Right, looks like we are over time now. Do we have any other questions we need to address at this point? I hate to cut anyone off, but we do have to let him go, and we have an executive officers meeting. Let's have a final question for Ian or anything. Not seeing any other question right now. All right, well, Councilman Thomas, thank you so much for being with us today and explaining and going over this. This has been very educational. It always is. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
I look forward to hearing more about this in the future from other people, and now that I'm a little bit more aware of it. So thank you very much. All right, everyone. It's about